All right. Hey, guess what? It's April 3rd, and this is Lecture 2. Good to see everybody. I know you were just watching a minute ago, but I'm still really excited that you're here. I really am. I wish I was there with you because I miss y'all. Y'all are awesome, and I miss being in the room with you, and I miss laughing with you, and I miss telling ridiculous stories about my dogs to you, which my dogs are awesome. They've been awesome this whole time. They're not going to know what to do when we go back to school in the fall because they're totally digging the fact that I'm home and they can run downstairs anytime they want. So maybe you got dogs like me. Maybe that's a bright, shining spot right now. We all need those bright, shining spots, right? So mine is my dogs, and I love that. So let's continue on in our lectures. let's keep going. We've talked a little bit about the world behind the text. We're going to dive in a little bit more into the world of the text, recognizing that this is where we start taking the text in of itself seriously. So if you'll go down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the 5th slide, let's look at this world of the text. And let's talk about why it matters. So the assumption was, for a long time, that meaning was rooted in our reconstruction of the meaning of the author based upon what we know of the author, what we could discern of the intentions of the author, historically reconstructing the world behind the text, the geography, history, culture, the religious, economic, political, all of those different worlds. And somehow if we can get to understand what it meant, we can understand what it means. But as we move into the 20th century, there's really a challenge to this assumption that history can hold the weight of meaning. Part of this is based upon our understanding of history as a whole. And the question that emerges is, when we talk about historical knowledge and what we know of history and how much history we can reconstruct, that is based upon the assumptions of a bit of objectivity, like we are objective observers of history saying this is what we see and this is what really was. But what we come to realize as we move into the 20th century is that maybe our perspectives or understandings of history aren't quite adequate and not necessarily the way in which we thought. So I want to clarify some terminology because I think this will help set us up for how we understand why the world of the text is so important. So 3 words that emerge. One is history, right? History is what actually happened, the events as they actually were. So there were events that took place, right? But what we come to realize is that historiography is the social location of the historian, right? The biases, the community to which that historian belongs to that has already shaped their perspectives and understanding of how we engage previous history and how our present assumptions can shape our understanding of what happened in the past. But as we get into scripture, we come to realize that also what we're dealing with is not simply history as we say facts and details, but it's historiography. Historiography is a process of historicity. Historicity is the process of delineating between what actually happened and the mythical retelling of those stories. So for instance, let me give you an example here, okay? So at some point in history, the Assyrian Empire was about to overrun Jerusalem. That's a fairly uncontended historical detail. As a historian, I might want to look back over and assess how and why the Assyrians didn't take Jerusalem. Now, what I have to understand is the historiographical complexity to that, because I'm already biased by the way I understand history and the way I understand the world in front of me. Okay? But then there's also a historicity about the telling of that story, because if you read the story through the lens of the Jews, Hezekiah prays, and then all of a sudden they're gone. The Assyrians are gone. If you read it from the perspective of the Assyrians, or you read it from the perspective of the Egyptians, all 3 of which have a telling of that story, the answer is significantly different. So there is a historicity in the way in which we understand history, in the way in which we tell history, based upon the events that happen. So the Jews tell history through a uniquely shaped theocentric lens. So God is at work in history kind of lens. And so what we need to understand is that when we're talking about history, we're talking about not only the events that happened, but where I stand as I try to make sense and interpret those events, and how the actual people telling those events as primary sources were telling them. So this basically gives rise to the idea that maybe history in of itself is carrying the full weight of meaning is unstable. Maybe we can't put everything into the history. So maybe meaning isn't fully located in history. And so then there's this what we call this sort of linguistic turn where we start to take language and the actual text itself and attempt to suggest that maybe meaning isn't located in this world behind the text because that is in some ways inaccessible to us, or at least skewed based upon our perspectives to the world around us. Maybe we ought to start locating meaning in the text itself. Maybe the text itself has the capacity to carry meaning. And this is outside of the author's intentions, because what someone who takes this linguistic turn and really focuses on text will do is say that once something is written, it becomes an object in of itself, and that object carries with it meaning. No matter what was meant by the author, once you turn loose of something, it has meaning. And if you've ever written anything, even a short text, you know how quickly that can happen. That you might have written something with the intentions that it would be received this way, but as soon as it becomes written, it becomes an object that has within it its own kind of meaning, right? That people infer from the actual. So is meaning wrapped up in, does it function within the text itself? So outside of what was, what is? And if we can discern how what is shapes meaning, maybe we can find meaning in the text. So we look into the text and we ask the question, what's in it? Its literary context. What does it do? Because when you write something and you speak something, it's not merely descriptive, right? We don't just write things in order to describe. Sometimes we're trying to compel. Sometimes we're trying to persuade. Sometimes we're trying to emotionally move. So I want you to think about some of the legal codes in Leviticus are written to do something different to the community than, for instance, some of the Psalms that evoke in us an emotional response. So the ways in which text and language does something to us also carries within it a certain degree of meaning. Or is it found, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, in its deeply embedded structures of language and communication, that if we can discern what those structures are, we can determine what meaning is. So this move away from just simply rooting meaning in the world behind the text is a move to root meaning in the text itself. And what I'm trying to remember here is that there's a movement happening, but we're going to learn how to navigate the tightrope of all three of them, recognizing that there is value in an integrative approach of behind, of, and in front of, okay? But the of world is suggesting that there's meaning in the text itself. So go down to the next slide, where it says the focus on the meaning of the text. And what I suggest here is that we can't simply reconstruct authorial intent as though we have access to the author and can read the author's mind. We must look to the text itself. And beyond the history of genre and form, remember we talked about form criticism on Wednesday, behind just simply knowing how parables or psalms or poems acted in antiquity, we actually begin to look to the literary genres or the forms of speech themselves as having a construction of meaning within themselves. Interpreting a poem is much different than interpreting a proverb. With the scriptures, because they are understood as a collective canon, reductionism, or trying to get to those just small little pericopes or small little pieces, doesn't always work. We got to understand the context of the text as a part of a larger corpus of a text. So we have a text, we have to understand how the text fits within the larger corpus of the canon of Scripture. What does the text hope to accomplish? In terms, are there clues within the text that tell us what it was intended to do to us? And then dialogues, redundancies, metaphors, similes, hyperbole, these all function to shape meaning. Okay, so what we're trying to get at is understanding how this world of the text holds meaning for us. If you move down to the next slide, there is just a few different forms of textual criticism, or excuse me, a few forms of in the world of the text kind of criticism. First is narrative criticism. And I love this quote. I found this in the Handbook of Biblical Criticism. It is interested not first of all as a source of understanding the historical circumstances in which the narrative was produced, the identity of the author, the audience for which it was being produced. So when it talks about narrative or the story, it's not necessarily trying to give you historical details. Instead, it says narrative criticism concentrates on the story being told, on the events that occur within it, the spatial and temporal settings of these events, and the characters who inhabit the story, including the social location, values, etc. It asks, what is the plot? How are the characters developed? What is the setting for those events for the narrative? So in a sense, it's treating the narrative in terms of almost like a drama that has meaning within itself. So when I go to a play, I don't necessarily look to who wrote it, what was the conditions of their life, and all of those different details. Now, I may eventually look that up, but when I go to a play, I kind of understand that the story of the play and the acting out of that play is going to carry a certain degree of meaning just within the play itself. The way in which the characters unfold, the way in which the plot moves, and there's something about the play that might move me. In Scripture, it's taken to a whole nother level, that the narrative actually constructs a reality that isn't pointing necessarily to a history, but the narrative itself is its own reality that it constructs a meaning and does something to the reader, and therefore has within it, the way in which the narrative presents itself, has within it a certain degree of meaning. Then there's what's called rhetorical criticism, which attempts to investigate the rhetorical patterns of the text to discern and discover the way in which language is used throughout the text by the author to convey meaning. Through the investigation of usage, one can arrive at the intention of the author. So, are there patterns of the ways in which language and the writing is being utilized to convey some sort of intention? So it's not like we go back to try to read the mind of the author. Instead of reading the text, we begin to discern the patterns or the genres or the types of language being used to convey a certain kind of meaning, and we can derive the intention based upon what we see in the rhetoric of the text itself. Then there's what's called canonical criticism. And this is recognizing that the Bible as a whole exercises some form of meaning on the individual texts themselves. So regardless of what Paul might have meant about the text in Philippi itself, that we need to understand that Paul's Philippian letter now as a part of the corpus of the canon of the New Testament has meaning as a part of that broader collection of letters, as a part of the broader New Testament, as a part of the broader canon itself. And so canonical criticism is about rerouting all of those smaller units in this bigger unfolding story. If you remember from the Blue Parakeet in the King and the Kingdom story, right, that kind of moves, and each one of these is like the wiki story, right? That's narrative. That's canonical criticism. Every one of those are little wiki stories of the bigger, broader King and Kingdom story that we learned about in Blue Parakeet. The final part is one I'm gonna talk briefly about it. This is philosophical, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time. It's called structuralism. This was a big move in the 20th century that suggested that communication as a whole carries with it a certain set of deeply embedded structures that all communication moves through, and that if you can get to those deely embedded structures of language, that you can derive meaning from a text by understanding the structures of language. And those structures are universal. All people in all places have the same kind of communicative structures that they utilize in conveying meaning. And so that's called structuralism, and that was a part of this in the world of the text kind of thing. So we're going to move on to the world in front of the text for our last lecture.